Good evening, everybody. I'm Stacy Sobel. I'm the Connecticut Director of the ADL, and we are very, very proud and honored tonight to host this important webinar, Voting for a Healthy Democracy, Exercising Our Fundamental Rights. Democracy is under threat. Extremism continues to be mainstreamed and normalized. Hate and conspiracy theories spread virally on social media around the globe. Voter suppression prevents free and fair elections. Against this backdrop, anti-Semitic incidents and other acts of bias are at an all-time high. Experts in democracy and political violence warn that our nation is moving toward an increased flawed democracy with growing risks of autocracy. But we know that a healthy democracy, where the exchange of ideas is respected and where institutions uphold norms, is crucial for freedom and flourishing of countless minority and marginalized communities. While we see voter suppression laws in more than a dozen and a half states, many states like Connecticut have enacted or are considering voter expansion laws. There is a wave of activists and thought leaders working to protect our democracy. And tonight, we are very fortunate to have three such thought leaders here with us tonight. Eileen Hershenov is ADL's Senior Vice President of Democracy Initiatives. She develops thought leadership and strategies for ADL's fight against authoritarianism and illiberalism, in addition to leading ADL's emerging litigation capacity. E.J Dionne and Miles Rapoport are the authors of 100% Democracy, The Case for Universal Voting. If you haven't already bought your book, please go out and grab it. It is terrific. It is very inspiring. E.J Dionne is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, a syndicated columnist for the Washington Post, and university professor in the Foundations of Democracy and Culture at Georgetown University. A nationally known and respected commentator on politics, E.J. appears regularly on National Public Radio and regularly on MSNBC. Miles Rapoport, Executive Director of 100% Democracy, an initiative for universal voting, and Senior Practice Fellow in American Democracy at the Ash Center. Miles is a longtime organizer and past president of the independent grassroots organization Common Cause, and he has previously served as our very own Connecticut Secretary of State and a state legislator for 10 years. We are thrilled to welcome each of them. But first, a few words from our very own ADL board member, Vicki Volper, about the very important upcoming Connecticut early voting referendum. So Vicki.
Thank you very much, Stacy. You probably do not know that Connecticut is one of only 4 states in the entire country that do not permit any in-person early voting. The other 3 are Mississippi, Alabama, and New Hampshire. Even Texas has early voting. Why is Connecticut an outlier? Because, unlike most other states, our voting rules are in our state constitution. That makes them really hard to change, even when they're outdated and no longer serve us. Hopefully, change will come soon. This year, on November 8th, there will be a ballot referendum asking voters to approve early voting. Keep in mind that depending on what town you live in, the question might appear on the back of your ballot or be in very small print and hard to find. So please make sure to look for it and vote yes for the freedom to vote early. If enough people vote yes, then the legislature will decide what in-person early voting will look like. They will decide how many days of early voting to allow and the mechanics of how it will happen. Naysayers have professed concerns about voting yes when we don't know how many days will be allowed, but that is the whole point. We want to allow the legislature to decide what makes sense for our state in consideration of any costs involved and logistical concerns of our towns. We trust our elected officials to make all kinds of decisions for us regarding our health, our safety, our environment. They can handle this. And remember, no one is forcing you to vote early. If you need more time to research the candidates, you can choose to vote on election day. Keep in mind that we're talking only about in-person early voting. So any claims that early voting is not secure are nonsense. We trust our registrars of voters to keep our ballots secure for us for the 14 hours of Election Day and to secure the absentee ballots as well. In-person early voting does not provide any additional security risk. Now, some people who are against early voting will argue that the absentee ballot option is sufficient, so we don't need early voting. That is simply not true. Absentee ballots are only available to certain voters who meet very specific constitutional requirements. Not everybody is eligible to vote absentee, so we need early voting too. Early voting offers all voters the ability to go to their town hall or other designated location and cast a ballot on days prior to Election Day. This flexibility is crucial for those who work multiple jobs or long shifts, and it's also necessary for parents of young children, seniors, elderly people. And what if we hear of a big storm coming up the coast that will hit Connecticut on Election Day? Early voting may be your only safe option. So I urge you to vote yes on November 8th for the freedom to vote early, because the more voting access we provide to our citizens, the stronger our democracy will be. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vicki. And ADL is part of a statewide nonpartisan coalition supporting the early voting referendum. With that, I will pass the baton to Eileen Hershenov, who will be moderator for the rest of the program. Thank you, Eileen. Thank you, Vicki.
Thank you so much, Stacy, and I'm so glad to be here. Hello to everybody in Connecticut. I'm Eileen Hershenov. As Stacy said, I am the Senior Vice President for Democracy Initiatives at ADL. And before we turn to the exciting speakers we have, I just want to spend a minute or two letting you know why ADL is making the protection of democracy a priority. As many of you know, our mission dating from 1913, when ADL was established, is to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and to secure justice and fair treatment to all. We can do neither part of that integrated mission if we do not have a robust democracy. As Jews, we know after 2,000 years in exile and a diaspora that we don't do so well when we depend on an autocrat, a monarch, a totalitarian regime that may be out of some noblesse oblige or discretion or a whim or a temporary political agenda that aligns with our needs. Maybe for a little bit we prosper, but then we don't. If we don't have a robust democracy with a rule of law, free, fair, and accessible elections, and we're going to be talking about that, and a separation of powers and checks and balances. In fact, no vulnerable group, in fact, no American would do well if we slide into a more and more flawed and illiberal democracy that even flirts with autocracy, which, as Stacy mentioned, is what we're facing today. So that is one reason why ADL is making protecting democracy a priority this year. And there are many, many entry points. And certainly Miles and E.J. are going to talk about one of the most important, but there are many entry points that you can choose to be in this fight for a robust democracy. For us at ADL, we're leaning hard into not only our longstanding voting work, and you'll be hearing again so much more about the vote in a moment, but because some of our longstanding expertise goes right to some of the biggest threats today, this is another reason why we're in this fight. Our focus on domestic extremism, on fighting online hate and harassment, and on anti-Semitism, those are all threats or accelerants to the threats that face us today. So that is why we are in this fight. And with that, I want to turn to EJ for my first question, because the universal voting, that's a brand new issue for most Americans. What made you and Miles want to write this book now and take this on?
Well, first, I want to thank Stacy and Vicki and Eileen. I could sit here. We should shut up and listen to you because I really appreciated those comments. I should say I've already early voted here in Maryland in the primary. I'm likely to early vote again. And two of my favorite pictures, I didn't early vote with our third kid, but two of my favorite pictures are when our youngest, our daughter, and our son cast their first ballots, and we went together and early voted. It's very convenient. It's good for democracy. And I really appreciated that comment. I also just really appreciate the ADL. I'm here tonight for two reasons. One is because of the admiration I have for your work, your fight against anti-Semitism, but also against all sorts of other forms of prejudice in our society and bigotry. So thank you for that. But also because I deeply admire the voters of Connecticut, because they elected my friend, Miles Rapoport, as secretary of the state. I learned Connecticut's the only state with that "the" in there. You learn a lot writing a book with a co-author. Also, that you elected one of my students, State Senator Will Haskell from Fairfield County, who I'm proud to say introduced our idea into the Connecticut State Legislature. And it's an appendix in his bill is an appendix in our book. So thank you all so much. Miles and I did this because we think it's time for a game-changing idea in our voting debates. And we believe this is that idea. Again, we don't, I should say right at the outset, we're not selling this as a magic elixir. There are all kinds of reforms that are needed in our political system. We argue, in fact, in the book that our system requires gateway reforms like early voting to really work effectively. But we believe that this is a big idea that can change things. And I'll just say a couple of things about it, and Miles can talk about how he got into this. I first myself got initially interested in the idea because for a variety of reasons, I've spent a lot of time down in Australia, which has had this system for 100 years. There are very few people, I think, who are going to come before you at a webinar or at a meeting with an idea that has 100 years of proof of concept. This idea has worked extremely well in Australia. They have a very effective system of election administration. They make it easy for people to register to vote, and then they require them to cast ballots with very modest penalties, and we'll talk about that as we go. The result is that 96% of Australians are registered to vote, and 90% of them vote on election day or earlier, but 90% of the registered cast ballots. That's a much higher turnout than we have, even on our really high turnout election of 2020, where only about 2/3 of us voted. That was a great breakthrough, and it was a wonderful thing, but it's still well short of where we could be. The other reason I care a lot about this idea is because I don't like the idea of our elections being like fancy dinner parties. If you think about it, we have an A list and a B list and a C list. We have an A list of voters who are registered and regularly vote, and politicians and their consultants pay all sorts of attention to those voters. There's a B list of people who might be registered but don't vote regularly. They get very little attention. And then there's a C list of the unregistered, and they get no attention at all. Democracy ought to be inclusive. We ought to be saying that we, as a democratic republic, are inviting everybody in. And we think universal voting, as it exists in Australia and has existed in about two dozen other democracies, is the way to do that. And that's why we think that after all our arguments about voting rights and forward movement and backward movement, we should just take the plunge and say, everybody is in, everybody votes.
Thank you for that. And I want to mention, I do all too few things religiously, but one of the things I do religiously, E.J., is read everything you write. And Miles, I have followed you. Let me ask, one of the things about Americans, we're pretty famous for not wanting to be told we have to do something, for not being compelled. So how do you respond to opposition along these lines?
Well, let me, before I answer that, I'll swing back around to it. But first I want to say, I want to thank Vicky for her comments about the constitutional amendment, and to say that I am 100% supportive of the idea of early voting. And I think it's great that it is getting the attention it's getting in Connecticut. You probably know this history, but in 2014, it was on the ballot. And, there just wasn't enough of a campaign, and it narrowly lost, which meant that it had to go through 2 more sessions of the state legislature and now come back on the ballot, 8 years later. So let's not miss our chance this time. I will say that I was, I'm sitting here in West Hartford, actually, in the home that I've lived in for 40 years. And I was out walking today and I saw a number of signs saying vote yes on question 2. So I was really glad to see that there's an active campaign going on for it. So Vicki, thanks for kicking us off with something that's, as they say, ripped from the headlines, and hopefully we'll have a success on November 8th. So I just want to say that I came to, echoing what EJ said, I came to this from a slightly different path. So I recently calculated that if you just go back to when I started to serve in the Connecticut legislature, which was 1984, I have been working on these democracy issues. I was on the elections committee for 10 years, and then as Secretary of the State. I've been working on these issues for 40 years. And I really believe that having a healthy democracy, encouraging full participation is critically important, and that the reforms like early voting, like expanded mail-in voting, like same-day voter registration, which Connecticut has now, which is great, and more states are adopting, all that is good. But then I looked at that and said, look, I've been working on this for all this time in various capacities. And here we are with record turnouts in 2018 and 2020, as EJ mentioned. The 2018 midterm election was a record turnout for a midterm, was 50.3%. And as EJ said, the 2020 election was the highest in 100 years for a presidential election, was still only 66.2% or 3%. So that's not something that you would want to write home about. And in 2015, I actually read a piece that EJ wrote. Like you, Eileen, I have always read everything that EJ writes. He wrote this with his Brookings colleague, Bill Galston, which made the case that we should adopt the Australian style voting. And by the way, we keep saying Australia, but it is actually universal voting, as you know, if you read the book, is in 26 countries around the world. There's slightly different forms, there's slightly different levels of enforcement, but this is hardly a new or radical idea. And so I said, all right, well, this could really be the game-changing idea that instead of moving the needle a little bit, which I think we've done, can really move the needle all the way to a 90% turnout. And that's great. And now to come back to your question, Eileen, well, with all that as prologue, the question you specifically asked about people not wanting to be told what to do, I find a very strong analogy with jury duty. We have had for 100 years mandatory service on juries. If you get called, you've got to go. If you don't go, you get fined. And, while people may not necessarily love it when the jury summons arrives, nobody says, how dare they make me serve on a jury? It is accepted. It is part of our culture, our civic culture, and people don't complain about it. So we think that, voting is in that same category for the same reason. The reason we want people to serve on juries, everybody to serve on juries, is so that you have a fully reflective jury pool to decide the guilt or innocence of people. And I think the exact same logic applies to voting, where we want, and we certainly should want, everybody to participate in decisions about the laws that we're governed under and the people who make them. So, I think there are some people who are going to say absolutely no, any compulsion beyond, the barest minimum I object to. But I think most people will really think about it if they really think about it. And that's the reaction we're getting, to say, this is interesting. We have to pay taxes. We have to go to school, send our kids to school till they're 16. We have to serve on juries. We have to fill out the census. There are a lot of things that we have to do because we want to have a society that works for everybody. I think this is in that category, and we'll try to make that case.
Could I just say something, Eileen, on
Please.
that? Because it is the question. I mean, at several events Miles and I have done over the last several months, we've gotten versions of the question: if Americans don't want to get vaccinated or wear masks to stay alive, how in the world would you ever sell this idea? So you asked it much more politely than we have been presented with it. And as everything Miles said is true, and I do think the jury duty analogy is the right one. But it's also the case that we have structured our proposal as much as we could to respond to what you might say is a deep libertarian or individualistic American sensibility. And so if I can describe it just briefly, how it works in Australia is that if you don't vote, you get a little notice in the mail. And if you give any sort of reason that's reasonable about why you couldn't vote, you don't get a fine. If you are fined, you are fined $20 Australian, which is $15 American. And only about 13% of the people who don't vote ever have to pay the fine. So what we view this as is much more a nudge than a shove. But then we take a couple of other steps. There is real concern about the piling up of fines, especially on low-income people, especially Black Americans who are of low income. So we make very clear there are no, there's no interest on this fine. It can't be expanded. $20 is $20. Second, it is not a criminal penalty. It can't be criminalized, so you're not going to go to jail for this. Third, if people don't want to pay the fine, they can do an hour of community service, and that would take care of it. But lastly, we also suggest that states that enact this have a conscientious objector provision, just as we had when we had a draft. Easy to get conscientious objector privilege. Some religious traditions don't like to participate in politics, but for whatever reason, somebody may just say, I do not want to vote. They could apply for that and they would not be subject to the fine. So we try in structuring it to be as conscious of our libertarian tradition. And the last thing that's very, very important, one of the reasons we call it universal voting rather than compulsory voting, is no one is compelled to vote for anyone. You can cast a blank ballot. You can draw slogans. You can even say nasty things on your ballot. You can do anything you want. You do not have to pick a candidate. You are required to participate. And just to make this very, very clear, we would add to every ballot, they already have this in Nevada and Arizona, a none of the above option. So if you wanted to take none of the above, you could do that. So this is not compulsory speech. You do not have to cast a vote, but you do have to participate. And we think that this system, based on the Australian experience, which we use because it's got the longest history, and it's the best, probably the best developed system of them all, although some of the others work well too. We would have extraordinary turnout, and election day would become a party, which is something we can get to as we discuss it here.
Well, I like that. And I think you actually answered what was my next question was going to be. I have found in years of organizing that Americans love to say, I have a First Amendment right. They say that, and I say this as a trained lawyer, even when the First Amendment has no application to whatever we're talking about. So I think you answered, but let me just draw that out again, because I know from experience, it's one thing to say I have to do some conduct. It's another thing to tell me I have to speak, So if you could just underscore what you said, why the First Amendment is not being violated if we tell people you have to go cast a vote.
Well, Miles, why don't you pick up? I'll just, since I just gave a fairly long speech, I want to let Miles come in on that, because this is something, we had a great group of lawyers working with us, and was precisely on that point. Go ahead, Miles.
Yeah, I'll frame a teeny bit by saying that before we wrote the book, E.J. and I were part of a universal voting working group, which was a joint project of the Kennedy School where I was and the Brookings Institution where E.J. was. And we had 28, really superb people, election officials, scholars, advocates, and particularly a half a dozen constitutional lawyers. And they looked very closely at it. Actually, we mentioned their names in the book, on the book cover, because they were so important to what we did. And what they said is there is, in fact, a fair amount of jurisprudence that says that you cannot compel speech. Can't tell students they have to recite the Pledge of Allegiance. You can't make people vote for somebody that they don't want to vote for, et cetera. But there's a distinction between compelled speech and compelled conduct, and compelled conduct has been upheld time and time again. And so, because what we're proposing is not that you have to go and cast a vote for or against any candidate or ballot initiative, just that you have to participate. So you can leave the ballot blank. In Australia, they call that a donkey ballot. or you can write somebody in. I'll write in Vicky Volper after the great speech.
I was just thinking that.
And or you can deface it. You don't have to do it. So therefore, you are not compelled to the conduct of participation doesn't imply speaking on behalf of one or another idea or being compelled. So we think, I'm sure it will be challenged if it's enacted either at the federal level or even at the state level, but we feel that there's solid constitutional grounds for this passing muster.
By the way, if there are lawyers out there, one of the chapters in the book I'm proudest of, even though Miles and I wrote about 2% of it, it was really put together by our lawyers, is our legal chapter, because in America, anything that's important, you get sued over. And in this case, it does raise constitutional issues, and we really wanted to address those fully. So our lawyers looked at both the federal constitution, but also at a lot of state constitutions. And it's, I think they did a wonderful job of being very true to the law, but explaining it in a very transparent, clear way.
I definitely found that. One of the things that really interested me about the book is you talk about some of the, maybe it's a misnomer to say sort of secondary good things that could come out of this, but you talk about some of the fights and some of the things if we went for universal voting, this could take off the table. And in an environment where there's this hyper partisan, toxic, weaponized polarization, even though it's not universal voting may not be directly aimed at easing that, would it have some secondary effects, do you think, on the kind of hyperpartisan warfare we now see?
Well, we would like to think, and we have made the case that if we had, took very seriously the task of election administration, and God bless all the people who volunteer for elections, and the threats against them right now are very scary and so wrong, because we all know these folks in my community. I love to tell the story of my late mother-in-law and her best friend. And my mother-in-law was a Democrat and her best friend was a Republican. And they worked the polls together election after election after election. And they totally trusted each other, and they wanted to help everybody vote. And there are millions of people like that around the country over the years who have helped us run elections. But we've never financed our elections appropriately. And it's not surprising. If you're on a town council or a mayor, you're going to get a lot more credit if you give money to schools or parks than you will if you give money to the Board of Elections. And so I think we can create a system that people really should have confidence in. I think we should have confidence in it now, but I think we could have a better system with shorter lines, more polling places, more opportunities to vote in various ways. But I think secondly, if everybody knows that everybody is voting, they know that this is a genuinely democratic system. And the ADL has always fought extremism. And we think this system really does fight extremism, because the people who would tend to be attracted to the polls by this system tend to be people who are less ideological, less extreme. There's a lot of evidence that is the sort of person who would be brought into the system. And the parties, and this is something Miles has said over and over again, that right now parties depend on turning out their base. That leads to campaigns based on enrage to engage. That's Miles's favorite phrase on this. And as a result, our campaigns themselves are extremely bitter. The last thing is, every politician would know they have to speak to everybody, because they know going in that everybody's going to vote. And we recently did an event online with a group of Australians where there was agreement across this vast ocean, a country and an ocean, that this has had a moderating effect in general on Australian politics. And we think it would have the same here over time. Miles, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, let me just put a little bit of an exclamation point on that point, which is that one of the things that I think universal voting would do is completely change the incentive system for campaigns and candidates. So right now, and I've heard this from Democratic consultants, and I'm sure there are Republican consultants saying the same thing, which is this 2022 is just a turnout election. We don't need to persuade people. We just need to get our people out, i.e., one more than the other team. And so the incentive is to just gin up your own base in the, which is reasonable, but also, if you can, to depress the base of your opponents. And that can happen, is happening in some places by legislation to make it harder for certain groups of people to vote in some states, thankfully not Connecticut. But it also is all the negative advertising. The negative advertising, EJ says this all the time, is not to persuade people to vote for the candidate other than the one that's being, attacked on the air. It's just to get you to stay home and to say it's not really worth it. If all these people are so terrible and all they're doing is slinging mud at each other, I'll just stay home. And that's really the point. But so I think that, again, if everyone has to participate, and so the campaigns do become about persuasion, because you've always got to speak to everybody. If you're saying extreme things, then everybody else is listening at the same time. So I think it would actually have a significant depolarizing effect. Would it solve the problem? No, it wouldn't. But I do think it would be a significant help. And I do want to say one other thing, which is that I cheated while EJ was talking and peeked at the participant list. And so I was delighted to see that some of my West Hartford League of Women Voter friends are even on this thing. And it was League of Women Voters posters that I saw in West Hartford today on my walk. So Carol and Nancy, thank you very much.
That's a great plug to the League of Women Voters. So it's just so intriguing, the ways in which this might reduce the toxic polarization and the incentive system. But let me ask you, we can't get Voting Rights Act legislation passed in Congress. It's gridlocked. The pundits are saying, regardless what happens in the midterms, it's going to be gridlocked. Where do we go with your idea? Do we go to Congress? Do we go to states? Do we pick certain states? What's the sort of practical strategy that we might use to implement your idea?
Well, the bill has been introduced in Congress by a Connecticut congressman, by Miles's congressman. In fact, pick that up, Miles, because Miles is doing a lot of organizing. He's set up. Is their website live yet, Miles?
Tomorrow. Going live tomorrow.
Miles is setting up the 100% Democracy, an initiative to get this into state legislatures, into city governments, where cities can experiment with this. Well, I'll just finish my part and then kick it over. I think that all kinds of reforms in the United States have often originated in states and cities and then eventually spread. The one I like to talk about is the secret ballot. We think the secret ballot is the way we always did this. Not at all. We didn't have secret ballots in the United States. People would vote openly. Ballots were printed by their own party or by partisan newspapers, and they bring them to the polls, and everybody would know how you voted. The secret ballot was an idea that came, guess what, from Australia. Another good idea they had that we adopted. It was known for decades as the Australian ballot. And it was controversial and it was debated, and state after state passed it until it became the national norm. And so what we would like to see is states and cities who have experimented in other areas with the single transferable vote, preference voting, which is now the rule in Maine. It's the rule in Alaska. It was used in New York City. There are reform-minded states. My own particular idea is I would love to see it adopted in Utah and Vermont, which has states that one is very Republican, one is very Democratic, but they've been open to election reform. And then also the District of Columbia, because those are obviously two very white states, and we'd like to see it adopted across. Obviously, this is an idea we want to see made national, and DC is a very diverse city. So to start out in that way, and Miles can talk more about the work he's doing to try to get this idea before other state legislatures. And we feel pretty good about it. But Miles, go ahead. Talk about the response you've been getting.
Yeah, well, first on the possibility of a federal bill, I do want to give a shout out to my Congressman John Larson, who actually saw EJ and me on Morning Joe one morning and got a copy of the book and called me up and said, I want to put this in for legislation. So Congressman Larson is the sponsor of the Civic Duty to Vote Act, HR 7563, if anybody wants to look it up. But I do think that, the point that you made before is well taken, which is, this is a completely gridlocked Congress. Can't pass the Voting Rights Act, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, or the For the People Act, or the Right to Vote Act. So I don't expect very much, but I do think that states, in what Justice Brandeis said was the laboratories in their function as laboratories of democracy, could very well be the place that it starts. So one interesting experience I had is that several of us actually went to the summit conference of the National Conference of State Legislatures, which was in Denver in early August. And we had a booth there and ended up having dozens and dozens of conversations with state legislators from around the country. I do think, let me come back. The most intriguing place actually is the state of Washington, where both the Senate Majority Leader and the Senate Elections Chair came up to our booth and said, we are going to put this bill in. So there will be a universal voting bill introduced with leadership support in the state of Washington. But coming back home, I actually do think that there's a real chance that we can have a serious discussion about that here in Connecticut. There was, as EJ said, Senator Haskell from Fairfield County submitted a bill. It didn't get as far as a public hearing. It was in the middle of COVID, and so they weren't really doing hearings in the same way. But I think that I have spoken to Representative Hilda Santiago from New Haven, who is on the elections committee, who says she really wants to file the bill. So I think there'll be both a campaign and a bill in Connecticut. And the other place I'm really excited about is the city of St. Paul. Minneapolis and St. Paul are charter cities. They both have adopted ranked choice voting and are very kind of progressively oriented. And so there's some real momentum especially in St. Paul, to try to get this done. So we're going to pick a few places, try to get it done. And then, as EJ says, hope that it goes viral would be too strong of a word, but hopefully it gets picked up by other places as we go along.
By the way, another state that I want to underscore, because I ran into our mutual friend from our working group. I think we have a real shot in Maine. To at least have a debate, because Maine has been quite progressive in its approach to elections, willingness to experiment and reform. And so that's another place I think is potentially promising.
Definitely. We have some meetings set up over the next 2 weeks.
Well, that's pretty exciting. What do you say to there's sort of a dominant narrative that anything that tries to expand the franchise, that tries to get more voters, is going to be opposed by Republicans because it's just going to help Democrats. What do you say about that narrative and how it affects the universal voting idea that you have?
Well, we deal with that in the book and have really tried to underscore that Republicans shouldn't be as afraid as some of them are of an expanded electorate. A good example there are a couple of examples, one in the book and one came after we finished the book. The one that came after we finished the book is in Virginia in 2001, when the Democrats took over the legislature and had the governorship. They enacted very broad voting reforms that made it much easier to vote. And there was a very high voter turnout in the 2021 governor's race, and Republicans won all three statewide offices. Glenn Youngkin won, and so did their lieutenant governor candidate, and so did their attorney general candidate. And it was a bigger electorate than before. In 2020, when you had, by modern standards in terms of a broad electorate that included women and Black Americans and others, really the highest turnout we ever had, people asked, well, how did Joe Biden win, but Republicans pick up, 10 seats in the House? It's because their turnout went up too. And in a lot of very Republican areas where turnout had been down among Republicans in 2018, the renewed turnout actually helped them win a number of districts. The other thing that heartened us, and granted, we did polling on this before the issues around elections were really became toxic with former President Trump's outrageous attack on the 2020 election and the false voter fraud narrative. But what we found is that Republicans and Democrats were absolutely alike in agreeing that voting is both a right and a duty. This was a view shared across partisan lines. I always joke that Miles and I are either the most honest or the dumbest book writers in the world, because when our polling showed that right now we don't have a majority with us. There are only 26% who support this idea. 48% said they opposed it strongly. My view of those numbers is actually quite positive, because to get 26% for an idea that's never been systematically advanced and that seems to violate certain what people think of are libertarian norms, I thought that was pretty good. But also that as I looked at the numbers, about half the people were persuadable, at least were willing to listen to arguments. And the gap between Republicans and Democrats in the idea was very small. So we think we probably need a less toxic environment, but we think there's plenty of evidence that higher turnout won't hurt Republicans. And secondly, that Republicans agree that voting is a civic duty.
Interestingly, just to add a kind of asterisk to that, I have been asked by some of my liberal Democratic friends, so Miles, are you really sure that this is going to help the Democrats? And my response is genuine, which is that's not what this is about. EJ and I are promoting this as a small d democracy reform, not as a kind of Trojan horse for Democrats. And I think, as EJ has pointed out, you can absolutely see scenarios in which Republicans would benefit. But the biggest thing is, I think all of us would benefit.
Yeah.
If we have the consent of all of the governed rather than 50% of the governed or 30% of the governed, we're just going to be a lot better off.
And I think our Australian sort of proof of concept helps here, because Australia's had the system for 100 years and they have had alternation of government. Labor wins some elections, the Conservative coalition led by, just to confuse us Americans, the Conservative Party in Australia is called the Liberals. But the Conservatives have won some elections, the Progressives have won others. And there are a handful of sort of libertarians who'd like to get rid of it, but both sides in Australian politics support this system and think it's better to have a system where whoever's elected knows that they reflect pretty much the entire country, that they won an election involving everybody.
It's pretty persuasive. I'm going to ask one more question for our part of the conversation, and then turn it over for a brief question and answer from with the audience. But a little while ago in our conversation, you made a very persuasive argument that universal voting could really cut down on the toxic polarization and the extremism, the having to go into the extremes because it's all about revving up your base. How about all the voter suppression laws we're saying? If we passed a universal voting, would it stop? Would it change the incentives? Would it override you have to have this kind of ID, or this has to match. You can't do this. You can't do the other thing. Could you get rid of the voter suppression things, or would they exist suppressing the vote at the same time the universal would try to expand it?
Go ahead, Bob.
Well, it's a very good question. And obviously, if you have a requirement of universal voting overlaid on a system which makes it harder for people to vote, that's a really bad idea. So, but number one, I don't think that this would pass in any place that had a kind of suppressive kind of and restrictive kind of voting system. The states that the places that we've mentioned as possibilities, Maine, Washington, Connecticut, St. Paul are all places that we have good voter laws that would encourage it. But as EJ says, I'll borrow a line from EJ, who says that the best way to ensure voting as a fundamental right is to declare it as a universal civic duty. If everyone has to vote, I do believe that even having a significant discussion about this, in a way, we're putting this out, I should say, as a North Star. We don't expect this to be adopted quickly in a lot of places, but I think, when we're having these, awful kind of pulls and tugs over, are we going to have 10 days of early voting or 5 days of early voting? We're going to have a photo ID or different kind of ID. This jumps over all that and just simply asserts that we want everyone to participate. We know it is possible from what's happened in other countries. And I do think that it would be a very, very strong argument against the kind of voter suppression laws that we're seeing.
And, when we did our polling, we asked people what they objected to if they weren't for the idea. And one of the things people said very reasonably is, how can you require everyone to vote if there are some jurisdictions that are making it difficult or impossible to vote? And so we have a chapter in the book on what we call gateway reforms that we think would accompany this system, that includes same-day voter registration, automatic voter registration, restoring the right to vote for citizens with felony convictions, online registration, pre-registration to 16 and 17-year-olds, early voting and vote by mail. So we are for this. In Australia, they make it very easy to vote. You can cast a ballot in any district, in any polling place in your state. In fact, I mentioned parties. This has become, it is so ingrained that everyone votes that election day becomes a party. And at every polling place, people are selling all kinds of wonderful food, particularly what are known as democracy sausages. There's a grill at every polling place. And just to be clear, we would have vegan alternatives in our system, but we suggest vegan alternatives. And it's such a thing now that newspapers and websites were listing which polling places had the best food, so you could decide where to go. But all this food is being sold to raise money for schools and other civic organizations. And what I love about that is it says, democracy is not just about election day, which is very important, but a strong democracy also leads to a strong civil society, a strong independent sector that helps keep us going. And that's the way, Australians sort of very visibly on election day show the link between, voluntary organizations, educational institutions, and the democracy itself.
Thank you. I want to turn to one of the questions in the chat from our audience. I don't know if this is a question for lawyers or what, but one of the things that voting rights activists are very nervous about is the case that the Supreme Court took out of North Carolina, which would say that state Supreme Courts don't have a power to rule on election law adopted by state legislatures. And of course, the reason why voting rights advocates are so scared about this is that actually both Republican and Democratic appointed judges really saved us in 2020, along with both Republican and Democratic election officials in many places. But the states said no to the courts said no to all these kind of both before the presidential election and after all of these different things that sort of counter majoritarian state legislatures were trying to do. So the question is, what do you think about this? And is there any impact or relationship with the chances for universal voting if this case proceeds and the Supreme Court says, yeah, the state courts have no say anymore about elections?
In a whole series of cases that have come before the Supreme Court, there are few ideas that are more simultaneously ridiculous and dangerous than this state legislature doctrine. If the court actually went along with this, it would essentially overturn 200 years of of precedent, of habit. No one has ever come up with this cockamamie idea that legislatures can act lawlessly, can act without supervision of their state constitutions. And it's particularly dangerous because if you have a gerrymandered state legislature where, and in some states, the gerrymanders are so bad that you can't even vote out the current majority, that majority can perpetuate itself indefinitely, and it can create election rules that keep one party in power nearly forever. it would overturn what shards are left of voting rights, the Voting Rights Act. It would be a catastrophe if the court went this way. I have talked to my smart court watcher friends here. There is a feeling that this, even for this 6-3 majority, this might be a step too far. And it may get 3 votes, it may get 4 votes, but I'm praying it doesn't get 5 votes. And I'm told that Roberts and possibly Kavanaugh understand that they've been willing to do some radical things, but that this would be a step, 5 steps too far instead of just 4 steps too far. But I hope that's right, because it's an awful, dangerous idea.
Another question that came in from the audience talks about the enormous patchwork of state and local and hyper-local regulations that affect how we vote here. There's no uniformity. And the questioner says that, they moved to Connecticut from Colorado. It was the first time when they came to Connecticut that they had to vote in a physical polling place. It was such a shock. So given all this local control, I guess this is a question maybe less about universal voting than what you think about how necessary it is to have a more uniform system across the United States for voting if we're going to get the voting up and have fair, free, and accessible elections.
One of the things that makes the Australian system work very well is that they have the Australian Electoral Commission, and it is powerful, it is well-funded, it is professionally run, it has civil service requirements for people who work there, and they set the standards and they go out and they make sure that people are registered. As EJ said, 97% of all Australians are now registered. And we are the only country among the advanced democracies that has elections administered by partisan election officials. And it's a really terrible idea. And I can say that because I was one. And I did oversee elections, and there were a lot of pressures. And it's much better if it's nonpartisan. And also, we're the only country where it is so balkanized, and with so many different jurisdictions, with so many different kinds of elections, far more elections than other places have, et cetera. So yeah, there's a lot of good work to be done to kind of rationalize that system, and hopefully get proper funding. Give the what's now called the Election Assistance Commission, which is they did that so that it would be clear that it didn't really have any power or authority, and do that. I want to say one quick thing, because I saw the question from the person who moved from Colorado. This constitutional amendment this year, the vote is about early voting. There will be another constitutional amendment in 2 years from now that will be to allow universal mail-in ballots. Right now, the Constitution of Connecticut prohibits the widespread use of absentee ballots because it lists in the Constitution all the reasons that you need the reasons that are allowable for not voting. And there is the Second Amendment is moving forward, but because it didn't get 2/3 vote in the legislature, it has to wait another 2 years. But hopefully we'll catch up to Colorado, which, by the way, has one of the absolute best election systems, gets really, really high turnout. They were second in the country in 2020. Minnesota was first and Colorado was second with, I think, 76% of the vote. So if you can bring some of that good vibe from Colorado, that will be great.
Another question is sort of, why are you, I'm going to somewhat paraphrase this question or re-paraphrase it. Why are you organizing yourself around universal voting? Wouldn't it change the voting culture even more in a better way to do things that address the winner takes all sort of systems, ranked voting, ranked choice, and so on and so forth?
Well, first of all, in the book, we note that there are a whole series of reforms that we think would be a good idea and that we endorse, including getting rid of the Electoral College for starters. And we are very much for ranked choice voting. And in Australia, they have both ranked choice voting and universal voting, and it works very well. I'll let Miles give his own. Miles has a great soundbite on this that I'll let him repeat. And so we very much would like this reform to be discussed alongside these various other reforms. Ranked choice has started to make its way through, and there are already a lot of advocates for that, and we cheer them on. We feel that, again, as Miles said, if you really want the big breakthrough in terms of participation and the cultural changes that we think would accompany universal voting, we think this idea would really change things in a fundamental way. But we wish all those other reforms well, and we'd like to see our reform discussed in tandem with them. But combining it with combining our idea with ranked choice voting would, Miles, and I'll let you do your soundbite.
Well, I want to lead up to it by saying there was a very interesting op-ed about 2 weeks ago in the New York Daily News. There was a congressional race in New York in which there were 17 candidates, and because it's a federal election, there was no ranked choice voting. So the candidate who won got 25% of the people who voted. So 75% of the people who voted in that election voted for someone else besides him, but he still won. So the argument that was made in this op-ed was that you need to do this, and it happened to be a person who probably will be a pretty good congressman, who spent $7 million, Dan Goldman is his name, spent $7 million of his own money. But what the op-ed said is you have to do three things in order, based on what happened in that congressional district. One, you have to have ranked choice voting, because if there had been ranked choice voting, the votes of those other 75% of the people who didn't vote for him would have been distributed, and maybe he would have gotten up to 50% or maybe not. But you're right, you should have to have 50% of the people who vote. But he also pointed out in the op-ed that only 20% of the eligible voters in the district voted. So what he would have gotten, even if he had gotten 51% of the people who voted, was slightly over 10% of the people in the district. So it says what you also have to do is you have to have both ranked choice voting and universal voting. He called for universal voting in the op-ed, because then you have everybody voting, and if you get 51%. So the net result is that if you combine universal voting and ranked choice voting, then everyone is voting and everyone is having their vote count in the way that they intended to. And I think that would be that combination, I think, is a really good system.
That is a good note to end this part of the program on, and we're right at time. EJ and Miles, thank you so much. I could keep talking to both of you forever. I hope I get more chances. So thank you so much from all of us.
Thank you for having us. And again, thank you for the work you're doing in this election, but that you do every day of the year. Really appreciate it.
I agree. I just want to echo what Eileen said. Thank you, Eileen. Thank you, Miles. Thank you, EJ. This was fascinating. And next time we're going to schedule more time, because this was so interesting. With that, I'm going to introduce Suzanne Pincus, who is the Connecticut ADL Board Chairperson, and she has a few words to close us out. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Stacy. Thank you so much to our panelists for this important conversation and for all the work that you do to advance democracy. To everyone watching, please remember to register to vote and to vote yes on November 8th to question 1, which is, shall the Constitution of the state of Connecticut be amended to permit the General Assembly to provide for early voting? Vote yes on question 1. Early voting makes participating in our democracy more convenient for every eligible voter. And as EJ and Miles described, wider voting means less extremism. Please also mark your calendars for November 1st to attend Fighting Hate for Good, where we will be celebrating the work of ADL and honoring Jeffrey Flax, the CEO of Hartford Healthcare, and ADL's own Margie Lipschitz Shapiro, both of them for their work in fighting anti-Semitism and securing justice and fair treatment to all. Finally, please join us at the Javits Center in New York City on November 10th for Never Is Now, the largest national summit focused on fighting hate. I hope to see you there. Thank you, everybody, and good night.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you.